The auctioneer's hammer. The auctioneer's hammer fell 3 times before Caleb Harlow understood what he was watching. They weren't selling livestock anymore. The 5 children stood on that platform like condemned prisoners, hollow-eyed, holding hands in a chain that was about to break. The oldest boy met Caleb's stare with something worse than fear. Resignation. He'd seen this before, knew how it ended. When the slick man in the bowler hat called out, "Split lot available, take your pick," Caleb's boots were already moving toward the platform. He had $60 in his pocket and no plan except one. Those kids were leaving together, or nobody was leaving at all. Welcome to a story about the price of keeping your word when the whole world wants you to break it. If this story reaches you, drop a comment with your city. I want to see how far hope can travel. Now settle in, because what happened next changed everything. The November wind carried the smell of manure and desperation through the stockyards of Prospect Junction, a nameless crossroads town that existed only because 2 railroad lines had collided there by accident. Caleb Harlow stood at the edge of the crowd, one boot propped on the lowest fence rail, watching men bid on horses they'd worked to death and cattle they'd slaughter by spring. He'd come for a draft horse, something strong enough to pull a plow through the rocky soil of his ranch 20 miles north. He hadn't come for this. The auctioneer was a red-faced man named Holloway, who spoke in a rapid patter that turned English into a kind of musical code. Caleb had learned to translate it over the years. The pauses meant the bidding was stalling, the rising pitch meant competition, the sudden drop into casual conversation meant he was trying to shame someone into paying more. It was a language of manipulation, and Holloway was fluent. "Sold. Bay mare to the gentleman from Cheyenne, $22. Holloway's hammer cracked against the wooden podium. "Next lot coming up, folks, and this one's special, real special." 2 ranch hands led the mare away. The crowd shifted, boots scraping in the dirt. Caleb straightened, thinking the draft horses were finally coming up. Instead, he watched 5 children climb onto the platform. They moved like prisoners ascending a gallows. The oldest was a boy, maybe 12, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that had learned not to show anything. He held the hand of a girl about 10, who held the hand of a younger boy, who held the hand of another girl, who clutched a tiny child against her hip. They formed a human chain, and Caleb could see the oldest boy's knuckles were white with the effort of holding on. "Now, I know what you're thinking," Holloway said, his voice shifting into something meant to sound paternal. "But these aren't orphans looking for charity. These are able-bodied workers looking for placement. The boy there," he gestured with his hammer, "strong as an ox, been working since he could walk. The older girl, she's got away with cooking and mending. Even the little ones can fetch and carry." A man in a bowler hat stood beside the platform, too well dressed for a stockyard. His suit was clean, his boots polished. He held a leather portfolio under one arm and surveyed the crowd with the expression of a man selling furniture. "Placement," Caleb heard himself mutter. The word tasted like ash. "5 children, folks, and here's the beauty of it." Holloway was warming to his pitch now. "You don't have to take all 5. Split lot available. Need a strong boy for farm work? Take the oldest. Need a girl to help your wife in the kitchen? Take your pick. Prices are negotiable based on age and utility." The crowd murmured. A few men leaned forward. Caleb felt something cold settle in his stomach. The oldest boy, Nate, Caleb would learn later, stood absolutely still. His eyes moved across the crowd with the mechanical precision of someone who had done this before, who knew exactly what he was looking at. When his gaze passed over Caleb, there was no plea in it, no hope. Just a kind of exhausted recognition, another auction, another crowd, another day of being inventory. "Now, I'll be honest with you," the man in the bowler hat spoke up, his voice carrying the smooth confidence of a traveling salesman. "These children lost their parents to fever last spring. Been in temporary care, but winter's coming and the church can't keep feeding them. They need homes, they need work, and you need workers. This is what we call a practical solution." Practical. The word made Caleb's jaw tighten. "What about keeping them together?" The question came from somewhere in the crowd. A woman's voice, uncertain. The bowler hat man smiled. "Ma'am, that's a lovely sentiment, but not practical for most families. These children understand the reality. They're prepared to be separated if it means each one gets a roof and a meal." Caleb watched the little girl, couldn't have been more than 4, press her face into her sister's shoulder. The sister, maybe 6 or 7, stroked the child's hair with mechanical patience, like she'd been doing it for so long it had become reflex. "Let's start the bidding at $15 for the boy," Holloway announced. "Strong worker, good age, plenty of years left in him." $15. The same price as the bay mare. 15. Do I hear 15? Gentlemen in the back, thank you, $15. Do I hear 16? Caleb's hands curled into fists. Around him, men were evaluating Nate the way they'd evaluated livestock all morning, checking his build, his posture, calculating the return on investment. The boy stood perfectly still, but Caleb could see his chest rising and falling too quickly, could see the tremor in the hand that held his sister's. 16. Do I hear 17? These children won't last long, folks. Don't miss your chance. The 10-year-old girl was crying now, silent tears that ran down her face while she stared straight ahead. The boy she held, maybe 8, had his eyes squeezed shut. The human chain was pulling tighter, fingers interlocked so hard they must have hurt. 17, 18, gentlemen from the Double Bar Ranch. Thank you, sir. $18 for the boy. Caleb thought about his ranch. 20 miles of bad road north of Prospect Junction, a 3-room cabin with a leaking roof, 60 acres of stubborn land that barely produced enough hay to feed his 3 existing horses. He had $60 in his pocket, his entire savings from 2 years of selling horses to the cavalry. He'd come to buy a draft horse so he could break more ground next spring, maybe plant wheat, maybe finally make something of the ranch his father had lost to drink and bad debt. He thought about going home alone, thought about the silence of that cabin, the empty spaces where his parents used to sit, the way sound echoed off walls when there was no one to hear it. He thought about these 5 children being pulled apart like pieces of a puzzle scattered across the territory, never to be whole again. 18 going once. All of them. Caleb's voice cut through Holloway's patter. The auctioneer stopped mid-syllable, heads turned. "I'm sorry?" Holloway blinked. Caleb pushed through the crowd, boots loud in the sudden quiet. "I said all of them. I'll take all 5. The man in the bowler hat smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never reached the eyes. "Sir, that's admirable, but the total cost for 5 children, how much?" The smile tightened. "Well, considering this boy is currently at 18, and the girls would be valued at, I've got $60. Caleb pulled the folded bills from his pocket, held them up. $60 for all 5, right now, no more bidding. The crowd erupted in murmurs. Holloway looked at the bowler hat man, who looked at Caleb with the expression of a card player who'd just been shown an unexpected hand. "Sir, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but $60 for 5 children is hardly—" "It's $40 more than you've got right now," Caleb interrupted. "And it's $60 more than you'll have if I walk away and tell everyone here what I think about men who sell children like cattle." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. The bowler hat man's smile disappeared entirely. His hand tightened on the leather portfolio. "These children are being placed in homes, not sold. Call it whatever helps you sleep." Caleb kept his eyes locked on the man. $60, all 5, together. Or I make a scene that'll have the territorial marshal asking questions you don't want to answer. It was a bluff. Caleb had no idea if there even was a territorial marshal in Prospect Junction, had no idea if selling children was illegal or just morally repugnant. But he kept his face hard and his voice steady, and he watched the calculation happen behind the bowler hat man's eyes. Money now or trouble later. The eternal equation of practical men. $60, the man finally said. But you'll sign papers, legal placement papers. You'll be responsible for their care, their behavior, everything. If they cause trouble, if they run off, if they... Give me the papers. 10 minutes later, Caleb stood in the stockyard office, signing documents he barely read. The bowler hat man, who'd introduced himself as Mr. Fletcher, placement coordinator for the Territorial Child Welfare Society, pointed to lines, explained clauses, used words like guardianship and liability and term of placement. Caleb just kept signing. His hand cramped around the pen, the ink smudged where his palm dragged across wet signatures. Through the grimy window, he could see the 5 children still standing on the platform, still holding hands. No one had told them they could get down. They just stood there, waiting for the next hammer to fall. "You understand you're taking responsibility for 5 dependents," Fletcher said, his voice carefully neutral now that the transaction was complete. "That's a significant burden for a single man. I've got a ranch, got a roof, got food. Do you have experience with children?" Caleb looked up from the papers. "Do you have experience caring about them?" Fletcher's face went stone. "I place over 100 children a year in good homes across 3 territories. I do more for these unfortunates than—" "You were about to split them up. Don't talk to me about what you do for them." Caleb gathered the papers, folded them roughly, shoved them in his coat pocket. "We done here?" "Yes." Fletcher's voice was ice. "But, Mr. Harlow, understand this. I'll be checking on those children. If I find they're being mistreated, if I find you've taken them for labor and nothing else, I'll have them removed so fast." "Good." Caleb met his eyes. "You do that. You come check. You come see how they're doing, and while you're at it, check on all those other kids you've placed in good homes. Make sure those homes are as good as you think." He walked out before Fletcher could respond. The November sun was starting to sink, turning the sky the color of rust and copper. The auction crowd had dispersed, moving on to the next lot, the next transaction. Only the 5 children remained on the platform, and Caleb realized with a sick twist in his gut that no one had given them permission to leave. They'd been trained to wait, trained to stand, trained to be obedient inventory. He crossed the stockyard, his boots loud in the settling dust. When he reached the platform, all 5 pairs of eyes locked on him. The oldest boy, Nate, positioned himself slightly in front of his siblings, a human shield barely 4 feet tall. Caleb stopped at the base of the steps. Up close, he could see the details Fletcher's sales pitch had glossed over: the threadbare coats, the shoes held together with twine, the hollowness in their faces that came from missing more than just meals. These kids had been hungry for things food couldn't fix. "My name's Caleb Harlow," he said quietly. "I've got a ranch about 20 miles north of here. It's not much, 3 rooms, drafty windows, roof that leaks when the wind's wrong. But it's got a wood stove that works, and I've got food stored for winter, and there's space for all of you." Nate's expression didn't change. "For how long?" The question hit Caleb harder than expected. How long? Like this was another temporary stop, another auction they'd have to endure in a month or a year. How long until the next time someone decided 5 was too many, until the next time practical solutions required splitting them apart? "For as long as you need," Caleb said. "I'm not splitting you up. I'm not selling you. I'm not sending you away. You're coming to my ranch, all 5 of you, and you're staying together. That's the deal. That's the promise." Nate studied him with eyes that had seen too many broken promises to count. "You don't even know us." "No, but I know what I saw up here. I know what that man was about to do. And I know I've got room for 5 kids who need to stay together." Caleb held out his hand. "So what do you say? You want to get down from this platform and come home with me?" The silence stretched. Somewhere across the stockyard, a horse whinnied. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of approaching snow. Then, slowly, Nate reached out and took Caleb's hand. His palm was small and rough and freezing cold. Caleb helped him down from the platform, then turned to the others. The 10-year-old girl came next. Elsie, he'd learn, her hand trembling as she placed it in his. Then Ben, the 8-year-old boy, eyes still squeezed shut like he was afraid to see what came next. Then Ruth, the 6-year-old, who refused to let go of the youngest child even as Caleb lifted them both down together. The little one, May, barely 4, stared at Caleb with huge dark eyes and said nothing at all. They stood in a cluster at the base of the platform, 5 children and 1 rancher who'd just spent his entire savings on a promise he had no idea how to keep. Caleb looked at them, really looked, and felt the weight of what he'd just done settle onto his shoulders like a yoke. "You got names?" he asked gently. Nate nodded. "I'm Nate. This is Elsie, Ben, Ruth, and May." He pointed to each sibling in turn. We were the Carver kids, but I guess we're whatever you want now." You're still the Carver kids, Caleb said firmly. You keep your name. You keep your family. That doesn't change. He glanced at the sinking sun. But right now we need to move. It's a 3-hour ride to the ranch, and I'd rather not make it in full dark. You kids ever ridden a horse? 5 head shakes. Of course not. Caleb's wagon was tied up near the livery, an old buckboard that had seen better decades, pulled by a mare named Rosie who was more patient than pretty. He loaded the children into the back, spreading out the empty feed sacks he'd brought for the draft horse he hadn't bought, trying to make some kind of cushion against the rough boards. They settled in without complaint, arranging themselves in the same formation they'd held on the platform. Nate in back, the others in front of him, May in Ruth's lap. A defensive position, a familiar position. These kids had learned to protect each other from whatever came next. Caleb climbed onto the driver's seat, released the brake, and clicked his tongue. Rosie leaned into the harness and the wagon lurched forward. Behind him, he heard a small gasp, May startled by the movement, and Ruth's soft shushing sound. They rolled out of Prospect Junction as the sun touched the horizon. Caleb didn't look back at the stockyard, at the platform where 5 children had stood waiting to be scattered like seeds in a hard wind. He kept his eyes on the road ahead, on the darkening hills that marked the way home. For the first hour, no one spoke. Caleb focused on driving, on avoiding the worst ruts in the road, on keeping Rosie at a steady pace that wouldn't jostle the kids too badly in the back. He could hear them shifting, adjusting, the soft murmur of Nate's voice occasionally telling one of the younger ones to hold on or sit back, the sound of siblings who'd learned to communicate in whispers. When the road leveled out and the last light faded from the sky, Elsie's voice drifted forward. Mr. Harlow? Just Caleb? A pause. Caleb, why'd you take all of us? It was the question he'd been waiting for, the question he wasn't sure he could answer. Why had he? A smart man would have walked away. A practical man would have bought his draft horse and gone home. A sensible man wouldn't have spent his entire savings on 5 kids he didn't know, didn't owe, couldn't afford. But Caleb had stopped being sensible the moment he saw that human chain on the platform. You ever see something you can't unsee? He asked quietly. Something that gets in your head and won't let go? Yeah, Nate said from the back. Lots of times. That's what happened to me today. I saw you 5 up there, saw what was about to happen, and I knew I couldn't walk away. Couldn't live with myself if I did. Caleb adjusted the reins, felt Rosie respond. My pa used to say that a man's worth is measured by the promises he keeps, and standing there in that stockyard, I made myself a promise. If I could stop what was happening, I would, so I did. You don't even know us, Nate repeated, but his voice was different now, less defiant, more confused. Maybe that makes it easier. Don't know you, so I don't know all the reasons why I shouldn't do this. Don't know all the practical arguments against it. All I know is your kids, your family, and family shouldn't be split up because some suit thinks it's more convenient that way. Silence from the back. Then Ben's small voice. Are you going to split us up later? The question cracked something in Caleb's chest. No. How do you know? Ruth asked. How do you know you won't change your mind when it gets hard? Caleb pulled Rosie to a stop. The wagon creaked, settling. He turned in his seat to look at the 5 children huddled in the back, 5 pairs of eyes reflecting the starlight, 5 faces that had learned not to trust easy promises. I don't know what you've been through, he said slowly. Don't know what happened after your folks died. Don't know how many times you've been moved or promised something that didn't happen. But I know this. I bought a ranch 3 years ago that everyone said was worthless. Spent 3 years breaking ground, building fences, working from sunup to sundown to make something out of nothing. You know why? Nate shook his head. Because once I decide something's worth doing, I don't quit. I don't walk away. I don't give up when it gets hard. Caleb held Nate's gaze. Today I decided you 5 are worth doing. So no matter how hard it gets, and it will get hard, I'm not quitting. I'm not walking away. And I'm sure as hell not splitting you up. That's not a maybe. That's not a we'll see. That's a promise, and I don't make promises I won't keep. May started crying, soft, hiccuping sobs that she tried to muffle against Ruth's coat. Ruth held her tighter, rocking slightly, and Elsie reached over to stroke May's hair. Ben just stared at Caleb with an expression somewhere between hope and terror, like he was afraid to believe but couldn't help trying. Nate's jaw worked. His eyes shone suspiciously bright in the starlight. Finally, he nodded once, sharp and quick, and looked away. Caleb turned back around and set Rosie moving again. The wagon wheels creaked into the darkness, carrying 6 people who'd been alone and 5 who might not have to be anymore. They reached the ranch 2 hours after full dark. The cabin sat in a shallow valley between 2 hills, a squat shadow against the star-scattered sky. Caleb had left a lantern burning in the window, a habit from years of coming home to an empty house, a way to pretend someone was waiting. Now, for the first time, someone actually was. He pulled the wagon up to the porch, set the brake, and climbed down. His legs were stiff from the cold and the long ride. Behind him, he could hear the kids starting to move, but slowly, like they weren't sure if they were allowed. "Come on," Caleb said, reaching up to help May down. She came willingly enough, though she immediately hid behind Ruth the moment her feet touched the ground. One by one, he helped them all down from the wagon. 5 exhausted children, who swayed on their feet but didn't complain. The cabin door stuck like always. Caleb had to put his shoulder into it, and when it finally gave way, the warm air that escaped was scented with wood smoke and coffee and loneliness. He'd left the stove banked that morning, and it had kept a low fire going all day. Small mercies. "Inside," he said, standing aside to let them enter. They filed in one at a time, staying in their protective formation. Caleb followed, shutting the door against the November night. The main room was just big enough for a table, 4 chairs, a wood stove, and a narrow bed in the corner where Caleb usually slept. 2 doors led to smaller rooms, one for storage, one that had been his parents' bedroom before they died. 5 kids. 3 rooms. No plan whatsoever. Caleb lit 2 more lanterns, filling the cabin with warm, flickering light. The children stood in the center of the room like they were afraid to touch anything, afraid to take up space. May had her thumb in her mouth. Ben's eyes were drooping with exhaustion. Even Nate, who'd been so defiant earlier, looked hollowed out by the day's events. "You hungry?" Caleb asked. Nate started to shake his head, then stopped. "Yes, sir." "Don't call me sir, makes me feel old." Caleb moved to the stove, opened the cast iron door, added 2 logs from the stack beside it. "I've got beans and salt pork. Got some cornbread from yesterday. It's not fancy, but it'll fill you up." He worked quickly, years of bachelor cooking making the process automatic. The beans had been soaking since morning. He dumped them in a pot with chunks of salt pork, added water from the bucket by the door, set it on the stove to heat. The cornbread he sliced thick, the knife scraping against the iron pan. While the food heated, he looked at the children. They hadn't moved. They just stood there, waiting for instructions, waiting to be told where to go and what to do and when to stop existing. "Here's how this works," Caleb said, keeping his voice matter-of-fact. "This is your home now. That means you don't wait for permission to sit down. You don't wait for permission to be warm. You don't wait for permission to exist. If you're tired, you sit. If you're cold, you stand by the stove. If you need something, you ask. Understand?" Slow nods. But still no movement. Caleb sighed. "Elsie, those chairs by the table? Pull them over here by the stove. Everyone sit down and get warm while this food heats up." That finally got them moving. Elsie dragged 2 chairs closer to the stove's warmth. Ben helped her with a third. They arranged themselves carefully, and Caleb noticed they automatically left 1 chair for him, still deferring, still trained to put adults first. He sat on the floor instead, leaning against the wall, long legs stretched out. "Tell me about yourselves. You said you're the Carver kids. Where were you from before?" The silence stretched long enough that Caleb thought they wouldn't answer. Then Nate spoke, his voice low and careful. "We had a homestead about 40 miles south of here. Pa worked it with Ma. We grew corn mostly, had some chickens, a milk cow. It was good." "What happened?" "Fever came through last spring." Nate's hands clenched on his knees. "Pa got it first. He died in 3 days. Ma fought it for a week, but..." He stopped, swallowed hard. "After she died, her brother came, Uncle Thomas. Said he'd take care of us, take us to his place in Denver." "But he didn't," Caleb said quietly. "No. He took us to an orphanage. Said it was temporary, Said he'd come back when he got settled. That was 6 months ago. Nate's voice went flat. The orphanage was full. They split us up, me and Ben in one building, the girls in another. We could see each other during meals, but that was all. Then they started placing kids. Said families wanted them. They took May first. Ruth made a small, wounded sound. Elsie wrapped an arm around her shoulders. I snuck out, Nate continued. Found where they'd sent her, a farm about 10 miles away. The woman there had 6 kids already, and May she just cried all the time, cried herself sick, so I took her and ran. Found Ben, found the girls. We stayed in a barn for 2 nights before they caught us. And took you to another placement, Caleb finished. Nate nodded. 3 more after that. Every time they'd promised to keep us together. Every time it'd last a few weeks before someone decided they only wanted 1 or 2 of us. Finally, they gave up trying to place us as a group. That's when Mr. Fletcher got involved. Said he'd find individual placements, good homes. Said being together wasn't practical. The beans were bubbling now, filling the cabin with the smell of salt pork and hunger about to be satisfied. Caleb stood, pulled bowls from the shelf, started ladling out portions. He made them generous. These kids looked like they'd been stretched thin for months. Here! He handed bowls around, gave everyone a thick slab of cornbread. Eat. We'll figure out the rest after. They ate like they'd been taught to be grateful. Slowly, carefully, not a crumb wasted. May fell asleep halfway through her bowl, her head drooping against Ruth's shoulder, and Ruth just shifted to hold her better while finishing her own food one-handed. No one complained. No one asked for more, even though Caleb could see they were still hungry. He refilled their bowls without asking. When the food was gone and the dishes stacked by the wash bucket, Caleb looked at 5 children who could barely keep their eyes open and a cabin with nowhere near enough beds. All right, he said. Here's what we're doing tonight. The back room's got my parents' old bed, double mattress, decent blankets. Girls, that's yours. Nate, Ben, you 2 take my bed in the corner here. I'll sleep on the floor by the stove. We can sleep on the floor, Nate said immediately. You don't have to. Not arguing about this. You're kids. You get beds. I'm a grown man with a bedroll and a warm stove. I'll be fine. Caleb stood stretched until his back cracked. Tomorrow we'll figure out something better. But tonight, everyone just needs to sleep. Fair? Nate looked like he wanted to argue more, but was too exhausted to manage it. Fair. Getting everyone settled took another 20 minutes. The girls disappeared into the back room with quiet goodnights. Ben climbed into Caleb's bed and was asleep before his head hit the pillow. Nate hesitated longer, standing by the bed like he was waiting for a trap to spring. You can sleep, Caleb said gently. I'll be right here. Door's locked. Stove's warm. Nothing's going to happen to you or your sisters. You can let go for a few hours. Nate's shoulders sagged. He climbed into bed next to Ben, pulled the blankets up, and closed his eyes. Within minutes, his breathing evened out into sleep. Caleb banked the stove, spread his bedroll on the floor, and lay down in the warm darkness. Around him, the cabin creaked and settled, making the sounds of a house sheltering people instead of just waiting for ghosts. From the back room, he could hear Ruth's soft humming, a lullaby maybe, for May. From the corner, Ben's sleep mumblings and Nate's steady breathing. 5 children, $60. 1 promise. Caleb stared at the ceiling and wondered what the hell he'd just done. Outside, the November wind picked up, rattling the windows and whistling through the gaps in the walls. Winter was coming. And somewhere in Prospect Junction, Mr. Fletcher was probably filing his papers and congratulating himself on another successful placement. But here in this drafty cabin 20 miles north of anywhere, 5 siblings were sleeping under the same roof for the first time in 6 months. They were together. They were safe. They were home. For tonight, that was enough. Tomorrow, Caleb would figure out how to keep that promise when the world wanted him to break it. Tomorrow, he'd face whatever came next, the logistics, the judgments, the inevitable problems. But tonight, he'd given 5 kids who'd lost everything one thing back: each other. The stove ticked softly as the metal cooled. Outside, an owl called across the valley. And Caleb Harlow, a rancher who'd come to town for a draft horse and left with 5 children instead, closed his eyes and let himself believe that sometimes the most impractical choice was the only one worth making. Dawn came cold and gray, turning the cabin windows silver with frost. Caleb woke to silence, the kind of complete quiet that only happened when people were holding their breath, waiting. He'd grown accustomed to waking alone, to the empty sounds of a house that held only him. This silence was different. This silence had weight. He pushed himself up from the bedroll, joints protesting the hard floor despite the proximity to the stove's warmth. The fire had burned down to coals during the night. He fed it fresh wood, waited for the flames to catch, then stood and looked around the cabin with new eyes. In the corner, Nate and Ben were still asleep, tangled together under the blankets like puppies. The back room door was closed, but Caleb could hear soft breathing from beyond it. 5 children, still here, still together. Yesterday's impulsive choice in the harsh light of morning. He moved quietly, setting coffee to boil, pulling out the last of the bacon and the cornmeal for mush. His stores were adequate for 1 man through winter. For 6 people, they'd last maybe 6 weeks if he stretched them. Another problem for the growing list. Right now, breakfast seemed more urgent than mathematics. The smell of bacon frying brought Nate awake first. Caleb watched the boy's eyes snap open, saw the moment of confusion, then the quick assessment of his surroundings, checking for his brother, checking for threats, checking to see if yesterday had been real or just another cruel dream. When Nate's gaze finally landed on Caleb, something in his shoulders relaxed by the smallest degree. "Morning," Caleb said quietly, not wanting to wake Ben yet. "Sleep all right?" Nate sat up, rubbed his eyes. "Yes, sir. Yes." He caught himself, remembering Caleb's request not to be called sir. "That's the best I've slept in a while." "Good." Caleb flipped the bacon, the grease popping in the pan. "You want to help me wake everyone for breakfast? Might go easier coming from you than from me." Nate nodded and slipped out of bed, padding across the cold floor in stockinged feet. He shook Ben gently, then disappeared into the back room. Caleb heard quiet murmurs, the shuffle of feet, and then all 5 children emerged, blinking in the morning light like creatures unused to daylight. They ate breakfast the same way they'd eaten dinner, carefully, gratefully, asking for nothing. Caleb made sure everyone got seconds of the cornmeal mush drizzled with the last of his molasses. May actually smiled when she tasted the sweetness, and the sight of it hit Caleb somewhere behind his ribs. "All right," he said when the dishes were cleared and stacked. "We need to talk about how this is going to work." 5 pairs of eyes locked on him, and Caleb saw the old wariness creep back in. They knew this conversation. This was when the rules got laid out, when the expectations got explained, when the price for room and board got named. He pulled one of the chairs around and sat backward on it, arms crossed over the top rail. Tried to look as non-threatening as a man his size could manage. "First thing, this is a working ranch. I've got 3 horses, 60 acres, fences that need mending, and about 1,000 things that need doing before the first snow. I can't do all of it alone, which means I'm going to need help. But you're kids, not hired hands, so here's what I'm thinking." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Nate, you're 12 and you've worked before. I'll need you with me on the bigger jobs, fixing fence, tending the horses, chopping wood for winter. I won't work you like a man, but I need you to work like someone who's part of keeping this place running. Fair?" Nate nodded slowly. "Fair." "Elsie, you said you can cook and mend. That true?" "Yes." Elsie's voice was barely above a whisper. "Ma taught me." "Then you're in charge of the kitchen and keeping our clothes in one piece. I'm a decent cook, but having help would make things easier. And I've been sewing my own buttons for 3 years. They mostly stay on, but they're not pretty." That got the ghost of a smile from Elsie. Progress. "Ben, Ruth, you're old enough to help with lighter chores, gathering eggs. Once we get chickens, feeding the horses, keeping the wood box full. Things that need doing but won't break your backs. May, you're still little, so your job is to stay warm and safe and let your sisters look after you when they need to. Everyone understand their part?" They nodded, but Caleb could see the question forming on Nate's face before the boy spoke it. "What happens if we can't do it? What happens if we're not good enough at the work?" There it was, the fear underneath everything, the belief that their worth was conditional, that failure meant being sent away. "Then we figure it out," Caleb said simply. "Look, I'm not expecting perfection. I'm expecting effort. You try your best, You learn as you go. You ask for help when you need it. That's all. This isn't an arrangement where you work to earn your keep. This is a family learning to function together, and in families, everybody contributes what they can. Some days that's a lot. Some days that's less. But it doesn't change the fact that you belong here. Ruth's eyes welled up with tears. Elsie bit her lip. Even Nate looked shaken, like the concept of unconditional belonging was too foreign to fully grasp. Now, Caleb continued, deliberately moving on before the emotion could overwhelm them all, we've got to make this cabin work for 6 people instead of 1. That means some changes. I'm thinking we clear out the storage room, make it into a proper bedroom. The girls keep the back room, boys take the new room once it's ready. Until then, we make do with what we've got. Questions? Where will you sleep? Ben asked. I'll figure something out. Might build a small addition come spring, might just take the storage room after we move things around. Don't worry about me. I've slept in worse places than a floor by a warm stove. They spent the morning reorganizing. The storage room was crammed with 3 years of bachelor accumulation, broken tack, empty crates, tools that needed fixing, the detritus of a man who'd been too busy surviving to properly organize. Caleb and Nate hauled everything out into the main room while Elsie swept years of dust from the corners. They found an old rope bed frame in pieces, parts of a second mattress that mice had gotten to, blankets that smelled like cedar and memory. This was my parents' overflow, Caleb explained, examining the bed frame. Pa built it when they first homesteaded here, before they could afford better. It's rough, but it's sound. He looked at Nate. Think we can put it back together? They worked side by side, Caleb showing Nate how the rope threading created support for the mattress, how to pull it tight so it wouldn't sag. The boy had good hands, learned quick, didn't need to be told things twice. They worked in companionable silence, the kind that didn't need filling with words. By midday, they had a functioning bedroom, small, barely big enough for the rope bed and a crate for storage, but private. Elsie had scrubbed the floor, and Ruth had contributed a small drawing she'd made with a piece of charcoal on scrap paper, a house with 5 stick figures in front of it. She'd tacked it to the wall with a bent nail, and it transformed the bare room into something that belonged to someone. It's perfect, Nate said quietly, and Caleb pretended not to see him wipe his eyes. They ate a lunch of fried potatoes and the last of the bacon, then Caleb made an announcement that changed the temperature in the room. I need to ride into town this afternoon. We need supplies, food, lamp oil, a few other things. It's a 3-hour round trip, so I'll be back before dark. The fear was immediate and obvious. May grabbed Ruth's hand. Ben moved closer to Nate. Even Elsie's face went pale. You're leaving? Nate's voice was carefully controlled, but Caleb heard the tremor underneath. Just for a few hours. We need food, and I need to... He stopped, realizing what they were hearing. Not that he was going for supplies, that he was leaving. That this was the moment when adults went away and didn't come back, when promises dissolved and children got left behind. I'm coming back, he said firmly. This isn't me leaving you. This is me riding to town for supplies and then riding home. To you. All of you. Can we come? Ruth asked, her voice small. Caleb hesitated. 3 hours on horseback through cold November weather with 5 kids who'd never ridden, just to prove he wasn't abandoning them. It was impractical. It would take twice as long. It would be uncomfortable and difficult and completely unnecessary from a logical standpoint. Get your coats, he said. The ride to Prospect Junction took nearly 5 hours with everyone doubled up on the horses. May rode in front of Caleb on his gelding scout, wrapped in a blanket and chattering quietly about the things she saw. A hawk, a rabbit, the way the frost made the grass sparkle like broken glass. Ruth rode behind Elsie on steady old Rosie, and Nate and Ben shared the third horse, a temperamental mare named Birdie, who tolerated the arrangement with patient disgust. They made a strange parade down the main street, a rancher, 3 horses, and 5 children who looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts of poverty. Caleb felt the stares, heard the conversations pause as they rode past the general store, the saloon, the land office. Let them look. Let them wonder. He had supplies to buy and no patience for small-town judgment. He tied the horses outside Mercer's general store and turned to the kids. Stay close. Don't wander off. If anyone asks you questions, you don't have to answer. Just point them to me. Understand? They nodded and filed into the store behind him like ducklings following their mother. Harold Mercer stood behind the counter, a shrewd man in his 50s who'd been selling overpriced goods to desperate ranchers for as long as Caleb could remember. His eyebrows rose when he saw the entourage. "Caleb Harlow. Heard you made quite a scene at the auction yesterday." News travels fast. Caleb pulled out a list he'd written that morning. "I need flour, cornmeal, beans, salt pork, lamp oil, coffee, sugar, and whatever dried fruit you've got that won't break the bank." Mercer's eyes drifted to the children clustered near the door. "That's a lot of supplies for a bachelor." "Not a bachelor anymore, apparently." Caleb kept his voice level. "Can you fill the order, or should I ride to the next town?" "I can fill it." Mercer started pulling items from the shelves, weighing them on his scale. "Just making conversation. People are curious is all. Single man taking in 5 orphans. It raises questions." "What kind of questions?" "The practical kind. You got experience raising kids? You know what you're doing? The Territorial Child Welfare Society is supposed to verify placements, make sure children aren't being taken advantage of." Caleb's hands curled into fists. "Those kids sleeping under my roof, eating my food and staying together, that's what I'm doing. Anyone who's got a problem with it can come talk to me directly instead of gossiping in a general store." Mercer held up his hands in placation. "Just saying what people are saying, Caleb. No need to get worked up." But Caleb was worked up because he could feel 5 pairs of eyes on his back, could imagine what they were hearing, that he wasn't fit, that this was suspicious, that someone should investigate. "How much for the supplies?" he asked flatly. $32. It was highway robbery, and they both knew it. Caleb had maybe $40 left after yesterday, and Mercer was gouging him because he knew Caleb needed these supplies and couldn't afford to shop around. But arguing would take time, and time meant keeping the kids standing there listening to people question whether they belonged with him. He counted out the bills, watched Mercer bag everything with deliberate slowness. When it was done, he loaded the supplies into the saddlebags and canvas sacks, distributing the weight across 3 horses. The whole transaction had taken maybe 20 minutes, but it felt like hours. They were mounting up when a voice called out across the street. "Mr. Harlow, a word, if you please." Caleb turned to see Mr. Fletcher approaching. That same leather portfolio under his arm, that same expression of professional concern on his face. Behind Caleb, he felt Nate tense. "Mr. Fletcher," Caleb's voice was ice. "I'm glad I caught you in town. I wanted to check on the children, see how they're settling in." Fletcher's smile was practiced, but his eyes were assessing. "It's standard procedure after a placement. They're fine." "I'd like to hear that from them, if you don't mind." Fletcher stepped closer, addressing the children directly. "How are you all doing? Is Mr. Harlow treating you well? Are you getting enough to eat?" Nate stepped forward before Caleb could intervene. "We're good. He's keeping his promise. All of us are together." Fletcher's smile tightened. "That's wonderful to hear, but you understand, young man, that I have a responsibility to ensure your welfare. That means periodic visits, inspections." "Then inspect," Caleb interrupted. "Ride out to the ranch, see where they sleep, see what they eat, see that they're together and safe. But don't stand here questioning them in the middle of the street like they're suspects." "I'm simply doing my job. Your job was selling them yesterday. Today they're in my care, which means you deal with me. You want to check on them? You come to the ranch. You want to ask them questions? You ask me first. And you sure as hell don't accost us in town and make them defend their right to be together." Fletcher's professional mask slipped for just a moment, showing the irritation beneath. "Mr. Harlow, I understand you think you're helping these children, but the reality is that single men are not typically approved for placement of multiple children, especially young girls. There are concerns about propriety, about—" "Say what you're implying out loud," Caleb said quietly, dangerously. "Stop hiding behind bureaucratic language and say exactly what you're accusing me of." The street had gone quiet. People had stopped to watch. Fletcher glanced around, clearly aware that this conversation was becoming a spectacle. "I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm simply stating that the society has standards, and I need to verify that those standards are being met. I'll be visiting your ranch within the week to conduct a proper inspection. If everything is in order, wonderful. If not—" He let the threat hang unfinished. "You do that," Caleb said. "And while you're at it, inspect all those other placements you made. Make sure those children who got separated are doing just as well as mine are together. He turned away before Fletcher could respond, helped May up onto Scout, and swung into the saddle behind her. The others mounted quickly, picking up on his urgency to leave. They rode out of Prospect Junction at a trot, leaving Fletcher standing in the street with his portfolio and his standards and his thinly veiled threats. Nobody spoke for the first mile. Then Elsie's voice drifted forward, tight with worry. "Is he going to take us away?" Caleb wanted to say no, wanted to promise that Fletcher couldn't touch them, that the papers he'd signed yesterday were ironclad. But he'd learned young that false promises were worse than hard truths. "He's going to try to find a reason," Caleb said honestly. "He's going to come inspect the ranch, and he's going to look for anything he can use to say I'm not fit to care for you. Not enough space, not proper supervision, not whatever the hell his standards require. He'll write it all down in that portfolio of his, and then he'll make his case to whoever decides these things." "So what do we do?" Nate asked, and Caleb heard the old resignation creeping back into the boy's voice, the sound of someone who'd learned that fights like this couldn't be won. "We don't give him a reason," Caleb said firmly. "We make that ranch as proper as any home in the territory. We show him that you've got beds and food and care and everything you need. We prove that being together with someone who wants you is better than being apart with people who just want your labor. And if he still tries to take you—" Caleb paused, feeling May's small body press trustingly against him, feeling the weight of 4 other children listening for hope. "If he still tries, then we fight. We fight until there's nothing left to fight with. Because I meant what I said yesterday. You're not getting separated. Not while I've got breath in my body." The silence that followed was different from the fear-soaked quiet of the morning. This silence had steel in it. "What do we need to do?" Nate asked, and his voice had changed too. Not resignation now, determination. "Survive the inspection. Show Fletcher we're a family that works. Can you do that?" "Yeah," Nate said, and behind him Caleb heard 4 other voices echo the same promise. "Yeah, we can do that." They rode the rest of the way home as the sun sank toward the horizon, turning the November sky the color of bruises and fire. When the ranch came into view, that small, drafty cabin with its crooked fence and struggling land, it looked different to Caleb than it had just yesterday. Yesterday, it had been a lonely place where he was slowly building something from nothing. Today it was home to 6 people, and the stakes of keeping it had just gotten infinitely higher. He helped everyone down from the horses, unloaded the supplies, showed Nate how to unsaddle properly, and brush the horses down. The work was familiar, grounding. Elsie took charge of putting the supplies away, organizing the flour and cornmeal in the bins Caleb showed her. Ruth and Ben carried armloads of wood inside, stacking it neatly by the stove. May sat at the table and arranged dried apples into patterns, humming to herself. They moved around each other with the awkward awareness of strangers trying to become something more. Not quite a family yet, but maybe the shape of one. The possibility of one. Dinner that night was beans and cornbread again, but with dried apples stewed in molasses for dessert. Caleb watched the kids eat, watched the way Nate made sure everyone got equal portions, the way Elsie helped May cut her cornbread into smaller pieces, the way Ben and Ruth unconsciously leaned against each other for comfort. These were patterns worn deep by loss and survival, and Caleb wondered how long it would take before they could relax enough to break them. After dinner, while Elsie washed dishes and Nate helped dry, Ben appeared at Caleb's elbow with a question that had clearly been building all day. "Do you know how to read?" Caleb looked down at the boy's serious face. "Yeah, I can read. Why?" Could you teach us? Ma was teaching me my letters before she died, but I've forgotten some, and Ruth never got to start, and May's too little, but Nate and Elsie can read a little, and I just thought—" He trailed off, looking embarrassed. Something tight loosened in Caleb's chest. Yeah, I can teach you. I've got some books, not many, but enough to start. We'll make it part of the evening routine. After dinner, before bed, we'll do lessons." Ben's face lit up with the first genuine smile Caleb had seen from him. "Really?" "Really. Go get your sisters and brother. Let's see what we're working with." They gathered in the main room, and Caleb pulled out his small collection of books, a Bible, a volume of Shakespeare his mother had treasured, a farmer's almanac, and a collection of frontier tales he'd read so many times the pages were soft as cloth. He started simple, having each of them read a passage aloud so he could assess their levels. Nate read haltingly but accurately, stumbling over longer words but getting the meaning. Elsie read more smoothly, her voice gaining confidence as she went. Ben knew his letters but struggled to connect them into words. Ruth didn't know any letters at all, just watched the others with wide, hungry eyes. "All right," Caleb said when they'd finished. "Here's what we'll do. Nate, Elsie, you keep practicing with the harder books. I'll work with Ben on connecting letters to sounds, and Ruth, we'll start with the alphabet. Every night after dinner, we read. Everyone gets better together. Sound good?" They nodded, and for the next hour, the cabin filled with the sound of halting syllables and Caleb's patient corrections. May fell asleep in Ruth's lap halfway through, and no one had the heart to move her. When the light grew too dim to read by, Caleb declared lessons over and watched the kids reluctantly put the books away, like they were afraid the opportunity might not come again. Getting everyone ready for bed went more smoothly than the night before. The girls disappeared into the back room with less hesitation. Nate and Ben climbed into their new room, tested the rope bed, declared it comfortable. Caleb banked the stove and spread his bedroll on the floor again, listening to the cabin settle around him. He was almost asleep when Nate's voice drifted out from the storage room turned bedroom. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" A long pause. Then, "Thank you. For today. For not leaving us behind, for standing up to Mr. Fletcher. For everything." Caleb stared at the dark ceiling, feeling the weight of that gratitude like a physical thing. "You don't have to thank me for keeping my promises, Nate. That's just what decent people do." "Yeah, well..." Another pause. "We haven't met many decent people lately, so thanks anyway." Caleb didn't trust himself to respond. He just lay there in the darkness, listening to 5 children breathe, and thought about Mr. Fletcher's inspection, about the scrutiny coming, about all the ways this fragile new thing could be broken apart. But tonight, they were together. Tonight, they were safe. Tonight, a 12-year-old boy who'd learned to expect the worst had said thank you, like he was starting to believe things might be different. Tomorrow, they'd prepare for the fight. Tomorrow, they'd worry about inspections and standards and bureaucratic threats. Tomorrow, they'd face whatever came. Tonight, they'd made it through one more day as something that looked almost like a family. And that would have to be enough. The inspection notice came 3 days later, nailed to the fence post at the end of the drive where Caleb couldn't miss it. Official territorial letterhead, Fletcher's precise handwriting, words that tried to sound neutral but carried threat in every line. Formal home inspection scheduled for Saturday, November 21st, 10:00 a.m. Presence of all residents required. Failure to comply will result in immediate removal of placed minors. Caleb stood in the cold morning air, reading it twice, then crumpled the paper in his fist. Saturday. That gave them 4 days to turn a bachelor's rough cabin into something that would pass Fletcher's standards, whatever those might be. He walked back to the house where Nate was already up, feeding the stove. The boy took one look at Caleb's face and went still. "He's coming Saturday," Caleb said without preamble. 10 in the morning. We've got 4 days to get ready. Nate's jaw tightened, but he just nodded. "What do we need to do?" Over breakfast, Caleb laid it out for all of them. The cabin needed to be spotless. Floors scrubbed, windows washed, everything organized. The children needed to look cared for. Clean clothes, no visible bruises or signs of neglect, well fed. They needed to demonstrate that this was a functional household, that Caleb was capable of providing proper supervision, that the arrangement was beneficial rather than exploitative. "He's going to ask you questions," Caleb warned, looking at each child in turn. "Probably separately, probably designed to trip you up or find inconsistencies. He'll ask if I'm treating you well, if you're being worked too hard, if you feel safe. You answer honestly, but you don't volunteer extra information. Short answers. Don't let him twist your words into something they're not." "What if he asks why we want to stay?" Ruth's voice was small but determined. "Then you tell him the truth because you're together. Because that's what matters most. Fletcher's going to try to argue that being together with me isn't as good as being separated in proper homes. You need to make him understand that being split up isn't living, it's just surviving." Elsie raised her hand like she was in school. "What if he says you're not a proper guardian because you're not married? That there's no woman here to care for us girls?" It was the question Caleb had been dreading, the argument he had no good answer for. In 1880s frontier society, the idea of a single man raising young girls without a wife was unconventional at best, scandalous at worst. Fletcher would absolutely use it as ammunition. Then we point out that plenty of widowed fathers raise daughters alone, and nobody questions their fitness, Caleb said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. We point out that you're being supervised, cared for, and kept safe, that you're learning skills and getting educated, that the alternative is being separated into different homes where you'd have no family at all. We make the case that an unconventional family is better than no family. Is it enough? Nate asked quietly. I don't know, Caleb admitted, but it's what we've got, so we make it work. They spent the next 4 days transforming the cabin. Elsie took charge of the cleaning with the fierce determination of someone who understood that dirt could be used as evidence against them. She scrubbed floors until the old wood actually showed grain, washed windows until light poured through without obstruction, organized the kitchen shelves with military precision. Ruth helped, her small hands surprisingly efficient at getting into corners and crevices. Even May contributed, carefully arranging items on shelves according to Elsie's instructions. Caleb and Nate tackled the outside, repairing the sagging porch rail, fixing the door that had stuck since last winter, cleaning out the barn and organizing the tack room. They worked in the kind of focused silence that came from shared purpose, and Caleb found himself impressed by the boys' work ethic. Nate didn't complain, didn't slack off, just kept moving from one task to the next with steady determination. On Thursday afternoon, while the girls were inside mending everyone's clothes to make sure nothing had visible holes or tears, Caleb and Nate sat on the porch steps taking a break. The November sun was thin and pale, offering light but little warmth. Can I ask you something? Nate said, not looking at Caleb. Always. Why are you really doing this? And don't say it's because you made a promise. I get that you're keeping your word, but why make that promise in the first place? You didn't know us. We're not your responsibility. You could have walked away. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching the wind move through the dry grass in the pasture. It was a fair question, one he'd been asking himself late at night when sleep wouldn't come and doubt crept in. You know what the worst part of losing my parents was? Caleb finally said. It wasn't the grief, though that was bad enough. It was the loneliness. This ranch, this cabin, it was built for a family, built for noise and mess and people filling up the spaces. After they died, it was just me and all this emptiness. I could hear myself think too much, All the ways I'd failed them, all the things I should have said or done different. The silence it ate at me. He turned to look at Nate. When I saw you five on that platform, I didn't just see kids about to be separated. I saw what my life had been for 3 years. Alone, going through motions, surviving but not really living. And I thought, if I could stop that from happening to you, if I could give you what I'd lost, maybe that emptiness wouldn't feel so permanent. Nate's eyes were suspiciously bright. So we're here because you're lonely? No. You're here because you're a family that deserves to stay together, and I'm someone who has space for a family. The loneliness is why I noticed you in the first place, but it's not why I'm fighting to keep you. I'm fighting because splitting you up would be wrong, and I'm apparently too stubborn to let wrong things happen when I can stop them. Even if it costs you everything? Caleb smiled grimly. Son, I didn't have much to begin with. $60, a struggling ranch, and a whole lot of empty rooms. Now I've got you 5, a purpose, and a reason to make this place work. Math says I'm coming out ahead. Nate laughed, a short, surprised sound that seemed to startle him as much as it pleased Caleb. That's terrible math. Yeah, well, I was never good at arithmetic. Come on, we've got more fence to fix before dark. Friday night, Caleb made them all practice. He had Nate ask the questions he thought Fletcher would pose, had each child practice answering until they could do it without hesitation or obvious coaching. It felt wrong, teaching kids to perform for a bureaucrat's inspection, but the alternative was worse. Do you feel safe here? Nate asked Ruth in his best imitation of Fletcher's officious tone. Yes, Caleb makes sure we're warm and fed and protected, Ruth recited, then looked at Caleb uncertainly. Is that good? It's honest, which is better than good. Keep going. They drilled until the younger one started yawning, until even Nate's attention began to drift. Caleb finally called it quits and sent them to bed, but sleep was a long time coming for him. He lay on his bedroll staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios in his head. What if Fletcher separated them despite everything? What if the law was on his side and Caleb's promises meant nothing against official paperwork? What if tomorrow ended with 5 children being torn apart while Caleb stood helpless, his $60 and good intentions meaning nothing at all? He must have eventually slept, because he woke to Elsie shaking his shoulder in the gray pre-dawn light. "Caleb, wake up. Something's wrong with May." He was on his feet before his brain fully processed the words, following Elsie into the back room where May lay curled in Ruth's arms, her small body shaking with chills despite being wrapped in every blanket they owned. Her face was flushed, her breathing rapid and shallow. Caleb pressed his hand to her forehead and felt the unmistakable heat of fever. "How long has she been like this?" he asked, keeping his voice calm even as his mind raced. "She felt warm when we went to bed last night," Ruth said, her voice trembling. "But I thought she was just warm from the stove. When I woke up an hour ago, she was burning up and shaking." Caleb ran through his limited medical knowledge, most of it learned from watching his mother tend to sick neighbors. Fever could be anything from a simple cold to something deadly. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest doctor, simple illnesses could turn fatal before you could get help. "Elsie, get me cool water and clean rags. Ruth, you stay with her. Keep her as comfortable as you can. Nate!" He raised his voice so the boy could hear from the other room. "I need you." Nate appeared in the doorway, took one look at May, and went pale. Caleb gripped his shoulder. "She's got a fever. Could be nothing, could be serious. I need you to ride to town, get Doc Harrison and bring him back here. Can you do that?" "I've never ridden that far alone." Nate's voice shook, but his eyes were determined. "But I'll do it. Just tell me which way to go." Caleb gave him quick directions, helped him saddle Scout, the steadiest horse, and watched the boy ride off into the dawn with fear and pride warring in his chest. Then he turned back to the cabin and the small girl whose fever could destroy everything they'd built in 4 short days. He spent the morning alternating between sponging May with cool water to bring down the fever and trying to get her to drink willow bark tea. She was barely conscious, mumbling words that made no sense, her small body radiating heat. Ruth refused to leave her side, and Elsie kept bringing fresh water and clean cloths with the mechanical efficiency of someone keeping panic at bay through action. Ben stood in the doorway looking terrified, and Caleb finally pulled him aside. "I need you to do something important. Mr. Fletcher is supposed to come at 10 o'clock for the inspection. I need you to watch for him, and when he arrives, you explain what's happening. Tell him May's sick, the doctor's been sent for, and the inspection needs to be postponed. Can you do that?" Ben nodded, looking relieved to have a task. He took up position on the porch, watching the road with the intensity of a soldier on guard duty. The fever climbed higher as the morning wore on. May's breathing became more labored, her small chest rising and falling too quickly. Caleb had seen enough sickness to recognize the signs of something more serious than a common cold. Pneumonia, maybe, or the influenza that had killed her parents. The thought made his blood run cold. At 10:15, Ben called out, "Someone's coming! 2 riders!" Caleb's heart sank. Fletcher, right on schedule, and undoubtedly ready to use this crisis as evidence of Caleb's incompetence. He stood, wiped his hands on a cloth, and prepared for the fight of his life. But when the riders came into view, one was Nate on Scout, and the other was a grizzled man in his 60s carrying a medical bag, Doc Harrison, who Caleb had met exactly once when he'd split his hand open on barbed wire 2 years ago. "Where's Fletcher?" Caleb asked as Nate dismounted. "Passed him on the road, told him what was happening. He said—" Nate hesitated. "He said he'd come back Monday instead, and that this better not be a stalling tactic." Caleb wanted to rage at the implication that he'd make a 4-year-old sick to avoid an inspection, but there wasn't time. He ushered Doc Harrison inside, showed him to May, and stepped back to let the professional work. Harrison examined her with quick efficiency, checking her throat, listening to her breathing, feeling the glands in her neck. His face remained professionally neutral, but Caleb saw the tightness around his eyes. "It's pneumonia," Harrison finally said. "Early stages still, which is good. Caught it in time." But she's going to need careful tending for the next few days. Keep her warm but not hot, fluids as often as she'll take them, and this medicine 3 times a day. He pulled a brown bottle from his bag. It'll help with the fever and the cough that's coming. You got anyone who can sit with her around the clock? We'll take shifts, Caleb said immediately. Whatever she needs. Harrison looked around the cabin, at Ruth, still holding May's hand, at Elsie hovering with fresh water, at Nate and Ben standing in the doorway like sentries. His gaze came back to Caleb with something that might have been approval. "You're the fellow who took all 5 kids from Fletcher's auction," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "Heard about that. Caused quite a stir in town." Harrison packed his stethoscope back in his bag. "Also heard Fletcher's planning to remove them. Says a single man can't properly care for children." Caleb's hands clenched. "We're doing fine." "I can see that." Harrison gestured to the spotless cabin, the well-fed children, the obvious care being given to the sick little girl. "But what I see and what the Territorial Child Welfare Society sees might be 2 different things. Fletcher's got rules and regulations on his side. You've got—" "What, exactly?" "I've got them," Caleb said simply. "And they've got each other. That's what matters." Harrison studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll be back tomorrow to check on the little one. My fee is $2 for the house call, 50 cents for the medicine. You got that?" Caleb did the math in his head. After buying supplies, after yesterday's fence repairs that required new nails, he had maybe $12 left. $2.50 would hurt, but May's life was worth infinitely more. "Yes, sir. Thank you for coming." Harrison tipped his hat and headed for the door, then paused. "You know, when Fletcher comes back Monday for that inspection, he's going to ask me about this. About whether you're capable of handling a medical emergency, whether these children are being properly cared for." Caleb's throat tightened. "And what are you going to tell him?" "I'm going to tell him the truth, that I arrived to find a very sick child receiving attentive care from a family that clearly gives a damn about her welfare, that the home is clean, the children are healthy aside from 1 case of pneumonia that's being properly managed, and that in my medical opinion, these kids are better off together here than separated anywhere else." Harrison smiled grimly. "I've delivered half the babies in this territory and tended to the other half when they got sick. I know what good care looks like, and I know what neglect looks like. This ain't neglect." He left before Caleb could find words to thank him properly. Nate closed the door behind the doctor and turned to Caleb with something like wonder on his face. "He's going to help us." "What?" "Maybe," Caleb said, not wanting to get hopes too high. "But May's still sick, Fletcher's still coming Monday, and we've still got to prove we belong together. Come on, we've got nursing to do." They organized shifts. Elsie and Ruth took the day hours, Caleb and Nate took nights, and everyone helped with feeding and medicine. May drifted in and out of fever dreams, sometimes calling for her mother, sometimes just whimpering in pain. Each time, whoever was on duty would sponge her down, coax medicine into her, whisper reassurances that she wasn't alone. By Sunday morning, the fever had broken. May woke up weak and confused but coherent, her eyes focusing properly for the first time in 2 days. Ruth burst into tears of relief. Elsie ran to tell Caleb, who was outside chopping wood to keep his hands busy and his mind from spiraling into worst-case scenarios. When he came inside, May looked at him with those huge dark eyes and whispered, "You stayed." "Well, of course I stayed," Caleb said, kneeling beside the bed. "Where else would I go?" "Mama and Papa didn't stay. They got sick and they didn't stay." Her voice was barely audible. "I thought you'd leave too." Caleb felt something crack in his chest. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she didn't, he took her small hand in his much larger one. "Listen to me, May. Your mama and papa didn't want to leave you. They fought as hard as they could to stay, but sometimes sickness wins and people die. That's not leaving, that's being taken away. You understand the difference?" She nodded, tears sliding down her thin face. "I'm not sick. I'm not going anywhere. Neither are your brothers and sisters. We're all staying right here, together, for as long as you need us. That's a promise, and I keep my promises. All right?" "All right," she whispered, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled, a tiny, fragile thing, but real. Doc Harrison came back that afternoon, pronounced May out of danger, and left more medicine with instructions to keep her quiet for another week. When Caleb tried to pay him, Harrison waved him off. Consider it my contribution to keeping this family together. But Caleb, he fixed him with a serious look. Tomorrow, when Fletcher comes, you make sure that man sees exactly what I saw. You make sure he understands what he'd be destroying if he splits you all up. Because I can testify about the medical care, but the rest is on you. After Harrison left, Caleb gathered everyone in the main room. May was propped up in the corner of the rope bed, wrapped in blankets, alert enough to listen. The others sat around the table, and Caleb could see the exhaustion in all of them. From the nursing, from the fear, from the constant awareness that tomorrow could change everything. I want to say something before Fletcher comes tomorrow, Caleb began. These past 5 days have been hard. We've worked ourselves ragged getting ready for an inspection that got postponed, then spent 2 days fighting to keep May alive. You're tired. I'm tired. And tomorrow we have to put on our best faces and convince a man who doesn't want to be convinced that we're a legitimate family. He paused, looking at each of them in turn. But here's what I realized while we were taking care of May. We are a legitimate family. Maybe not the conventional kind, maybe not the kind that fits Fletcher's paperwork, but we take care of each other. We work together. We fight for each other. That's what family does, and we've been doing it since the moment I brought you home. So tomorrow, when he comes with his questions and his doubts and his standards, we don't perform for him. We just show him the truth, that 5 kids who lost everything found each other again, and found someone who's committed to making sure they never lose each other. We show him that this family is real, even if it doesn't look like what he thinks a family should be. Nate stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. What if the truth isn't enough? What if he takes us anyway? Caleb met his eyes steadily. Then we fight harder. We appeal to whoever's above him. We get Doc Harrison to testify. We make noise until someone listens. But Nate, I need you to hear this. No matter what happens tomorrow, no matter what Fletcher says or does, I'm not giving up on you. Any of you. You're not going back to being separated. Not while I'm breathing. The silence that followed was heavy with hope and fear in equal measure. Then Ruth spoke up, her voice small but steady. We're not giving up either. We'll do whatever it takes to stay together. Even if it means being perfect for one more day, Elsie added with a tired smile. Even if it means being perfect, Caleb agreed. Now, early bedtime for everyone. Tomorrow, we show Mr. Fletcher what a real family looks like. They scattered to their routines, washing up, changing into night clothes, settling into beds. But before Caleb could spread his bedroll on the floor, Nate appeared from the boys' room. Can I ask you one more thing? Always. If he does take us tomorrow, if the law says he can and you can't stop it, will you come after us? Caleb didn't hesitate. Yes. I don't care if it's legal or not, if it's practical or not. If he takes you, I'll come get you. I'll find where he places each of you, and I'll bring you home. That's not a maybe, Nate. That's an absolute certainty. The boy's shoulders sagged with relief. Okay, that helps. Knowing you'd come. I'd come. I'd always come. Now get some sleep. Big day tomorrow. Nate nodded and disappeared back into his room. Caleb settled onto his bedroll, but sleep was elusive. Outside, the November wind rattled the windows and whispered through the gaps in the walls. Somewhere in Prospect Junction, Mr. Fletcher was probably preparing his questions, sharpening his standards, getting ready to judge whether this strange, makeshift family deserved to exist. Caleb stared at the ceiling and made himself a promise. Tomorrow, when Fletcher came with his portfolio and his doubts, he would see more than a bachelor rancher and 5 orphans trying to survive. He would see a family that had earned its right to stay together through 2 days of fighting pneumonia, through late-night reading lessons, through shared work and shared meals and shared determination. He would see what Caleb had seen since that first day at the auction. 5 children who were worth every dollar, every sleepless night, every risk. And if Fletcher still couldn't see it, if he still wanted to tear them apart in the name of propriety and procedure, then Caleb would do exactly what he'd promised Nate. He'd fight until there was nothing left to fight with, and then he'd find a way to fight some more. Because that's what family did. That's what promises meant. And Caleb Harlow had never broken a promise in his life. He wasn't about to start now. Monday morning arrived cold and clear, the kind of crystalline November day that made everything look sharper, more exposed. Caleb was up before dawn, feeding the stove and putting coffee on to boil with hands that weren't quite steady. Today would decide everything. Whether this fragile family they'd built over 8 days could withstand bureaucratic scrutiny, whether Fletcher's standards would matter more than what Caleb knew in his bones to be right. The children rose without being called, moving through their morning routines with unusual quiet. Elsie had laid out everyone's cleanest clothes the night before, shirts she'd mended until the patches were nearly invisible, dresses she'd let out at the hems so they'd fit properly, trousers that Caleb had hemmed himself with inexpert stitches that at least kept them from dragging in the dirt. They dressed carefully, as if armor could be made of cotton and homespun wool. May was still weak from the pneumonia, but her fever had stayed gone through the night. Ruth helped her into a faded blue dress that had probably been pretty once, before months of hard use and harder circumstances had worn it thin. The little girl's face was pale against the fabric, but her eyes were alert, watching everything with the wariness of someone who'd learned that safety was temporary. Breakfast was oatmeal sweetened with the last of the molasses, eaten in near silence, broken only by the scrape of spoons against bowls and the tick of the stove. Caleb tried to think of something reassuring to say, some speech that would calm the fear he could see in 5 pairs of eyes, but the words wouldn't come. Everything he could think of sounded like a lie or a promise he might not be able to keep. Finally, Nate spoke. What time is he coming? 10 o'clock, same as Saturday. Caleb drained his coffee, bitter and strong. We've got about 2 hours. Elsie, can you and Ruth make sure everything's in order inside? Nate, help me with a final check outside. Ben, you keep May company and make sure she stays warm. She can sit by the stove, read if she wants, but she needs to take it easy. They scattered to their tasks, and Caleb tried not to see it as the preparation it was. Battle stations, defensive positions, a family arranging itself to withstand assault. He and Nate walked the property, checking that the fence repairs were visible, that the barn looked organized, that nothing would give Fletcher ammunition to claim neglect or incompetence. The work was meditative, grounding, and Caleb found himself grateful for Nate's silent presence beside him. You scared? Nate asked as they finished checking the last of the fence line. Terrified, Caleb admitted. You? Yeah. Nate kicked at a clump of frozen dirt. I keep thinking about all the times we got moved before. All the promises people made about keeping us together and how they all broke anyway. And I know you're different. I can feel that you mean it, but his voice cracked. What if meaning it isn't enough? Caleb stopped walking and turned to face the boy fully. Then we make it enough. We fight, we appeal, we make ourselves impossible to ignore. But Nate, I need you to understand something. Even if Fletcher has the law on his side today, even if he has the power to take you, that doesn't make him right. And it doesn't make me quit. You hear me? Nate nodded, but his eyes were wet. I just don't want to lose them again. Losing Mama and Papa nearly killed me. Losing my sisters and brothers after that? I don't think I can survive it a third time. You won't have to. Caleb gripped the boy's shoulder. Whatever happens in the next few hours, you remember this. You're not alone anymore. None of you are. That doesn't change based on what some bureaucrat decides. They walked back to the cabin in silence, and Caleb tried to believe his own words. At 9:45, a rider appeared on the horizon. Not Fletcher's neat buggy, but a single horseman moving at an easy pace. As the figure drew closer, Caleb recognized Sheriff Dugan, a weathered man in his 50s who ran Prospect Junction's limited law enforcement with the weary pragmatism of someone who'd seen too much and expected too little. Caleb met him at the fence line. Sheriff, didn't expect to see you today. Dugan dismounted, tied his horse with practiced efficiency. Fletcher requested I accompany him for the inspection, said he wanted an official witness to his findings, someone who could testify to the territorial board if needed. He looked at Caleb with something that might have been sympathy. Sounds like he's building a case. Against what? Keeping siblings together? Against unconventional placement arrangements that don't fit the society's guidelines. Dugan pulled off his gloves, tucked them in his belt. Look, Caleb, I'm just here to observe. I've got no stake in this beyond making sure everything stays civil, but between you and me, Fletcher's got backing for this. The Warwick family, you know them? Caleb's blood went cold. The name's familiar. Big ranch east of town, right? Lots of land, lots of money, lots of influence. That's them. Word is, Mrs. Warwick took a shine to the idea of having a young boy to help her husband with the ranch. She was at the auction, saw Nate before you made your bid. When Fletcher told her you'd taken all 5 kids, she apparently complained to the territorial board, said it was wasteful for one man to take 5 children when respectable families only wanted 1 or 2. Dugan's expression hardened. Fletcher's inspection today isn't just about whether you're fit. It's about whether he can legally justify breaking up your arrangement to satisfy the Warwick's request. The world tilted slightly. This wasn't just bureaucratic scrutiny, it was a targeted effort to take Nate specifically, to break apart what Caleb had fought to keep whole. He thought about the boy behind him in the cabin, about the promise he'd made, about what it would do to all 5 children to be separated again. They can't do that, Caleb said, but he heard the uncertainty in his own voice. I signed papers. Legal placement papers. Papers Fletcher drew up with clauses about periodic review and the society's right to relocate children if circumstances warrant. You read all of it before you signed? Caleb hadn't. He'd been too focused on getting the kids away from that auction platform, too desperate to keep them together to scrutinize the fine print. The realization sat in his stomach like a stone. What can I do? Dugan looked toward the cabin, where Caleb could see small faces pressed against the window glass. You can be honest. You can show Fletcher and me exactly what this arrangement looks like, good and bad. And you can hope that what you've built here is strong enough to outweigh whatever pressure the Warwicks are applying. He paused. For what it's worth, I've seen a lot of placement situations in this territory. Most of them are about free labor dressed up as charity. If what you've got here is different, make damn sure we see that. Another rider appeared on the horizon, Fletcher's buggy this time, drawn by a matched pair of bays that probably cost more than Caleb's entire ranch. The placement coordinator drove with the unhurried confidence of a man who believed the law was on his side. And maybe it was. Maybe Caleb's 8 days of promises and reading lessons and nursing a sick child through pneumonia wouldn't matter against official procedures and wealthy families who wanted what they wanted. But he'd meant what he told Nate. He wasn't giving up. Not today. Not ever. Fletcher pulled up to the cabin and climbed down from the buggy, that familiar leather portfolio tucked under his arm. He'd dressed for the occasion, suit pressed, boots polished, every inch the professional administrator doing his duty. His eyes swept over the property with practiced assessment, no doubt cataloging everything that could be used as evidence. Mr. Harlow, Sheriff Dugan, thank you for being prompt. Fletcher's tone was businesslike, but Caleb caught the edge of satisfaction underneath. This man thought he'd already won. Shall we proceed with the inspection? Before we do, Caleb said, keeping his voice level, I want to be clear about what this is. You're here to verify that these children are being properly cared for, correct? To ensure they're safe, healthy, and living in adequate conditions? Among other considerations, yes. Then let's focus on that, not on whatever pressure you're getting from families who want to cherry-pick children for their own purposes. Not on whether my situation fits your conventional standards. Just on whether these 5 kids are better off now than they were 8 days ago. Fletcher's expression went cold. I don't appreciate the implication that I'm acting on anything other than the children's best interests. Then prove it. Come inside, ask your questions, make your assessment, but do it honestly, without an agenda. For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other across the frozen ground. Then Fletcher gestured toward the cabin. After you, Mr. Harlow. The inspection began in the main room, with Fletcher noting everything in his portfolio, the dimensions of the space, the condition of the furniture, the state of the stove and cooking facilities. He ran his finger along the windowsill, checking for dust. He opened the cupboards, counting supplies. He examined the wash bucket, the soap, the cloths hanging to dry. Every detail was recorded in that damned portfolio, and Caleb couldn't tell if the man was being thorough or deliberately hunting for flaws. The children stood in a nervous cluster by the table, and Caleb saw Fletcher's eyes linger on them with an expression that was hard to read. Assessment, certainly, but also something that might have been discomfort, as if their presence complicated his neat plans. Where do the children sleep? Fletcher asked. Caleb showed him the back room where the girls stayed, then the converted storage room where Nate and Ben had their rope bed. Fletcher examined both spaces with meticulous attention, measuring distances, checking the bedding, opening the single window in each room to verify ventilation. He made notes about the proximity of Caleb's bedroll to the children's rooms, about the lack of interior doors with locks, about the general lack of separation between adult and child spaces. "These sleeping arrangements are highly irregular," Fletcher said, his pen scratching across the page. "In a proper placement, there would be clear boundaries between the guardian's space and the children's quarters. Here, everyone is essentially sharing one large room with minimal privacy." "It's a frontier cabin, not a boarding house," Caleb replied. "Privacy is a luxury, safety and warmth aren't. These kids have beds, blankets, and a warm stove. They're sleeping better here than they did in any of your previous placements. You can't possibly know that. Ask them." Fletcher turned to the children, and Caleb saw them straighten almost imperceptibly, readying themselves. "Is that true? Are you sleeping well here?" "Yes, sir," Nate said, and the others nodded in agreement. "Better than before?" "Much better," Elsie added quietly. "We're all together. That makes everything better." Fletcher's jaw tightened, but he just made another note and moved on. He inspected the kitchen next, questioning Elsie about meal preparation, asking to see their food stores, inquiring about nutrition and variety. Elsie answered with quiet competence, showing him the organized shelves, explaining the meal rotation she'd established, demonstrating that yes, the children were eating adequately and regularly. Then Fletcher turned his attention to May, still sitting by the stove wrapped in blankets. He crouched down to her level and Caleb tensed, ready to intervene if needed. "Hello, May. I'm Mr. Fletcher. Do you remember me?" May nodded, her thumb creeping toward her mouth before she caught herself and folded her hands in her lap instead. "I heard you were very sick a few days ago. How are you feeling now?" "Better," May whispered. "Caleb took care of me, and Ruthie, and everyone." "Did he now?" Fletcher glanced at Caleb. "I understand a doctor was called. That must have been expensive." $2.50, Caleb said evenly. "Money well spent to save a child's life. And you have the means to continue paying for medical care if needed? The means to support 5 children through winter, through illness, through all the expenses that arise?" It was the question Caleb had been dreading, because the honest answer was barely. He had maybe $10 left, a ranch that produced minimal income, and winter approaching with all its demands for firewood and food and 100 other necessities. On paper, he was one emergency away from destitution. But numbers didn't tell the whole story. "I have a ranch that's functional and improving. I have skills. I can train horses, mend fences, do carpentry work for neighbors who'll pay. I have enough stored food to get us through winter if we're careful, and come spring I'll plant crops that'll bring in money for next year. Will it be tight? Yes. Will we manage? Absolutely, because that's what families do. They figure it out together." Fletcher made a long notation. "And if you can't figure it out? If you run out of money? If you can't feed them? If the ranch fails? Then I'll find work elsewhere, do whatever it takes to keep us afloat. But that's a hypothetical problem, and you're here to assess the actual situation. Right now these kids are fed, clothed, sheltered, and cared for. That's not speculation. That's fact." Sheriff Dugan, who'd been silent throughout the inspection, finally spoke up. "If I may, Fletcher, I've seen poverty in this territory, real poverty, where children go hungry and cold because their guardians genuinely can't provide. This isn't that. These kids look healthy, the cabin's in good repair, and there's food on the shelves. You can argue about financial projections all you want, but the present reality seems adequate." Fletcher shot Dugan a sharp look, clearly not appreciating the sheriff's input. "I appreciate your perspective, Sheriff, but the society's standards require more than just adequate. We need to ensure long-term stability, appropriate supervision, and proper moral environment." "Meaning what exactly?" Caleb asked, though he already knew where this was heading. "Meaning that a single man raising 5 children, particularly young girls, presents certain concerns. Without a wife to provide female guidance and supervision, without the proper family structure, there are questions about whether this arrangement serves the children's best interests." Fletcher closed his portfolio with finality. "I need to speak with each child individually. Standard procedure for placement verification." Caleb wanted to refuse, wanted to keep the children close, where he could protect them from Fletcher's manipulations. But refusing would only provide ammunition for Fletcher's case. Fine, but I want Sheriff Dugan present for each conversation. And the interviews happen here, in the main room, where the other children can see you're not taking anyone away. Fletcher looked like he wanted to argue, but Dugan nodded. That's reasonable. I'll observe. They started with Nate, sending the other children outside with instructions to stay close. The boy sat at the table across from Fletcher, spine straight, hands folded, every inch of him radiating tension. Caleb stood by the stove, forcing himself to remain silent, to let Nate speak for himself. Nate, I need you to be completely honest with me, Fletcher began. Are you happy here? Yes. Are you being forced to work beyond your capabilities? No. Caleb gives me jobs I can handle, teaches me how to do them right. It's not about working me hard, it's about learning to take care of the ranch together. Does Mr. Harlow ever lose his temper, ever hit you or your siblings? Never. Nate's voice was firm. He's patient. He explains things. Sometimes he gets frustrated, but he never takes it out on us. What about your sisters? Are they receiving appropriate care and supervision? They're receiving better care than they got in any of your placements, Nate said, and Caleb heard the edge in his voice. Elsie's not being worked like a servant. Ruth's learning to read instead of just doing chores. May's being treated like a kid, not like a burden. They're safe here. Fletcher's pen paused. Safe from what? From being separated. From being sent to families who only want one of us. From having to choose between staying together and having a roof over our heads. Nate leaned forward. You want to know if we're happy here? We're not just happy. We're whole again. That's what Caleb gave us. Not just a house or food or chores, he gave us back our family. The room fell silent. Fletcher stared at Nate like he'd said something in a foreign language, something that didn't fit in the neat boxes of the portfolio. Dugan's expression had gone soft around the edges, and when Caleb caught his eye, the sheriff gave a small, approving nod. I see, Fletcher finally said. Thank you, Nate. Please send in Elsie. The interviews continued. Elsie, steady and articulate, explaining how she'd learned to manage a household, how Caleb had given her responsibility without burden. Ben, still shy but earnest, talking about reading lessons, and how nice it was to sleep in the same house as his sisters again. Ruth, whose answers were short but heartfelt, who kept saying we're together, like it was the only thing that mattered. They saved May for last, and when she settled into the chair with Ruth standing protectively behind her, Fletcher's approach gentled noticeably. May, do you like living here? Yes, Caleb's nice. He got the doctor when I was sick, and he reads to us at night, and there's always breakfast, and nobody says we're too many. She looked up at Ruth, then back at Fletcher. Are you going to take us away again? The question landed like a physical blow. Fletcher's professional mask cracked, just for a second, showing something that might have been shame or regret or simple human discomfort with what he was about to do. I'm trying to make sure you're all in the best possible situation, he said carefully. We are, May said with the absolute certainty of a 4-year-old who knew her own truth. We're together. That's the best. Fletcher closed his portfolio and stood. Thank you, May. You can go outside with your brothers and sisters now. When the children had filed out and it was just Caleb, Fletcher, and Dugan in the cabin, Fletcher turned to face them both with his professional mask firmly back in place. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Harlow. Under normal circumstances, what you've created here would be adequate. The children are clearly attached to you. The living conditions are acceptable if unconventional, and there's no evidence of abuse or neglect. However, I have concerns that go beyond the immediate situation. Let me guess, Caleb said. The Warwicks want Nate, and you're looking for justification to give him to them. Fletcher's expression didn't change. The Warwick family is a respected, established household with considerable resources. They can provide opportunities for young Nate that a struggling bachelor rancher simply cannot. Education, social connections, a stable future, these things matter. And what about his family? Do his brothers and sisters matter? Of course they do, which is why I'm not proposing to separate all of them. The girls could remain here, under your care, young Ben as well. But Nate is at an age where he needs male guidance from someone with more resources, more stability, more money, Caleb interrupted. Say what you mean, Fletcher. You're arguing that rich people deserve poor people's children because they can buy them better things. I'm arguing that we have a responsibility to place children in situations that maximize their potential. The Warwicks can offer Nate things you cannot. Except the one thing he actually wants, which is to stay with his family. Caleb's voice was rising despite his efforts to stay calm. You talked to him. You heard him. He's not some orphan looking for the highest bidder. He's a boy who lost his parents and nearly lost his siblings, and the only thing holding him together is knowing there's still a family. You take him from them now, you might as well rip his heart out. Fletcher stood his ground. Sometimes difficult decisions must be made for a child's own good, even if they don't understand it at the time. Nate is 12 years old. He lacks the maturity to understand what he's giving up by staying in this marginal situation when he could have so much more. He understands just fine, Dugan said quietly. Both men turned to look at the sheriff, who'd been silent for the last several minutes. I've been listening to you talk about resources and stability and opportunities, Fletcher, and I've been watching those kids outside through that window. You know what I see? He gestured toward the glass, where the 5 children had gathered in a tight cluster near the fence, holding hands in that same protective formation they'd had on the auction platform. I see 5 kids who've learned that adults lie, that promises break, that families get torn apart in the name of practicality, and I see them holding on to each other like they're afraid if they let go, they'll disappear. You really think taking Nate to the Warwicks is going to maximize his potential? Or is it going to teach him that what he loves most can be bought and sold by people with money and influence? Fletcher's jaw worked. With all due respect, Sheriff, child placement policy isn't within your jurisdiction. No, but I know what's right and what's legal, and they're not always the same thing. Legally, you've probably got the authority to relocate that boy, but morally, you'd be committing the same crime as splitting them up the first time. Dugan crossed his arms. I'm just here to observe like you asked. And what I'm observing is a placement that's working, kids who are thriving, and a man who's keeping a promise when it would be easier to break it. You put that in your report. Fletcher's face had gone red. My report will reflect my professional assessment based on established guidelines. Not sentiment, not emotion, but policy. He turned to Caleb. You'll receive official notification within the week. In the meantime, the current placement remains in effect, but I'm recommending to the territorial board that Nate Carver be transferred to the Warwick household for his own benefit. They'll make the final decision. When? Caleb's voice was flat, dead. Likely within the month. These things take time to process. So I've got until then to prepare a 12-year-old boy for having his family ripped away from him again. That's what you're telling me. Fletcher picked up his portfolio, tucked it under his arm with precise movements. I'm telling you that the society acts in the best interests of children, even when those interests conflict with temporary attachments. Good day, Mr. Harlow. Sheriff. He walked out without another word, leaving Caleb and Dugan standing in the suddenly too quiet cabin. Through the window, Caleb could see Fletcher approaching the children, could see Nate's face go pale as the placement coordinator said something brief. Then Fletcher climbed into his buggy and drove away, and the 5 children turned as one to stare at the cabin with identical expressions of terror. What do I tell them? Caleb asked, and he didn't recognize the broken sound of his own voice. How do I tell them I failed? You didn't fail, Dugan said firmly. You gave them 8 days of being a family again, and you've got about a month to figure out how to keep that from ending. Don't waste it on despair. Use it to fight. How? Fletcher's got the law on his side, the Warwicks have money and influence, and I've got a struggling ranch and good intentions. What can I possibly do? Dugan was quiet for a moment, then, You ever hear the story about the rancher who went up against the railroad company? Everyone said he'd lose, that he couldn't fight corporate power with nothing but stubbornness. But he fought anyway, made enough noise that people started paying attention, and eventually the railroad backed down because the public pressure was too much. I'm not fighting a railroad. I'm fighting child welfare bureaucracy. You're fighting for family, which is something people understand. You make this story public. You get people to see what's happening here. You might force the territorial board to reconsider. They can ignore one rancher's complaints, but they can't ignore public outcry. Caleb looked out at the 5 children who were slowly, hesitantly making their way back to the cabin, and something hardened in his chest. Dugan was right. He'd promised to fight, and that meant using every tool available, even if it meant making himself and these kids the subject of territory-wide gossip and scrutiny. You know anyone who works at the Territorial Times? Caleb asked. Dugan smiled grimly. I know a reporter who loves nothing more than exposing bureaucratic overreach. Give me a day. I'll set up a meeting. Thank you. Caleb extended his hand and Dugan shook it firmly. Don't thank me yet. You're about to make yourself very unpopular with some very powerful people. Make sure you're ready for that. I made myself a promise 8 days ago, Caleb said. I'm ready for whatever it takes to keep it. Dugan nodded, collected his hat, and headed for his horse. Caleb watched him ride away, then turned to face the children filing into the cabin with questions and fear written all over their faces. Nate spoke first. He said he's recommending I be placed with another family, the Warwicks. Is that true? There was no point in lying. Yes. The cabin erupted. Ruth started crying. May grabbed onto Nate's leg like she could physically prevent him from leaving. Ben stood frozen in shock. Elsie went pale but stayed silent, her hands trembling as she reached for her siblings. Nate alone remained calm, but Caleb could see the grief and rage warring behind his eyes. When? Within the month. But Nate... Caleb crossed to them, knelt down so he was at their level. Listen to me. All of you. This isn't over. Fletcher made his recommendation, but the Territorial Board makes the final decision. And before they do, we're going to make sure they hear from everyone who knows that keeping you together is the right thing to do. We're going to fight this with everything we have. How? Nate's voice cracked on the word. They have power, money, influence. What do we have? We have the truth, Caleb said. We have Doc Harrison who will testify about the medical care you received. We have Sheriff Dugan who witnessed this inspection. We have 8 days of proof that this family works. And we're going to tell that story to everyone who'll listen until the Territorial Board can't ignore it. And if they still take me... Caleb met Nate's eyes and spoke the promise he'd made in the dark hours of the morning. Then I come get you. I don't care if it's legal or not, if the Warwicks have papers or not. I will come get you and bring you home. That's not a threat. It's a certainty. Because you're my family now, all 5 of you, and I don't let my family get stolen. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then Nate nodded once, sharp and decisive, and pulled his siblings into a tight embrace. They stood there in the middle of the cabin, 5 children holding on to each other with desperate strength, while Caleb looked on and felt his heart break and harden simultaneously. This wasn't the ending Fletcher wanted. This wasn't the neat, practical solution of separating children into convenient placements. This was a family refusing to be destroyed, a promise being kept despite impossible odds. And Caleb Harlow, a rancher who'd come to town 8 days ago for a draft horse and left with 5 children instead, stood in his cabin and prepared for the fight of his life. Because some things were worth fighting for, some promises were worth keeping, and some families, no matter how unconventional, no matter how recently formed, were worth defending against anyone who tried to tear them apart, even if it cost him everything, especially then. The reporter from the Territorial Times arrived 2 days later, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Mills who rode up to the ranch alone and introduced herself with a handshake that could crack walnuts. She was maybe 40, dressed in practical riding clothes, with a notebook that looked like it had survived a war and a pencil stub she kept behind her ear. Sheriff Dugan said you've got a story about child welfare corruption, she said without preamble. I'm listening. Caleb told her everything. The auction, the $60, Fletcher's threats, the Warwick's manipulation, the impending separation. Catherine wrote it all down in shorthand that looked like chicken scratches, interrupting occasionally with questions that cut straight to the heart of things. When he finished, she looked up from her notebook with an expression he couldn't quite read. You know what you're starting here? You go public with this. You're not just fighting Fletcher. You're fighting the entire Territorial Child Welfare Society, questioning their methods, their placements, their right to make these decisions. You'll make enemies, powerful ones. I've already got enemies, Caleb said. What I need are allies. Catherine smiled, and it was sharp as broken glass. Then you've come to the right place. Give me 3 days to interview witnesses, verify facts, and write this up. When it runs, it'll be front page, and it'll make people pay attention. She interviewed everyone. Doc Harrison, who testified about the medical care and the obvious bond between Caleb and the children. Sheriff Dugan, who gave a detailed account of the inspection and Fletcher's clear bias toward the Warwicks. Even Harold Mercer from the general store, who grudgingly admitted that yes, Caleb had been buying supplies appropriate for feeding 5 children, and yes, the kids had looked healthy if thin. Catherine spoke to the children themselves, listening with fierce attention as they described their previous placements, their separations, their desperate hope to stay together. When she left on the 3rd day, she shook Caleb's hand again and said, "Article runs Monday. Brace yourself." The weekend passed in tense anticipation. Caleb tried to maintain normalcy, chores, meals, reading lessons in the evening, but everyone could feel the weight of what was coming. Nate had grown quieter, more withdrawn, as if he was already preparing himself for the loss. The younger children orbited him constantly, touching his hand, leaning against him, trying to memorize the feel of having their brother close. Sunday night, Caleb found Nate sitting on the porch long after everyone else had gone to bed, staring out at the dark hills with his arms wrapped around his knees. "Can't sleep?" Caleb asked, settling beside him on the cold boards. "Keeps running through my head. What happens when they come for me? Whether I fight or just go quiet. Whether it's better to make it hard on everyone or just let it happen." Nate's voice was hollow. "I keep thinking about Mama and Papa. They fought the fever so hard, but it took them anyway. Sometimes fighting just makes the losing hurt more." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Your parents didn't lose because they fought. They lost because fever doesn't care how hard you fight." "But this is different, Nate. This isn't disease or fate. This is people making decisions, and people can be changed. Their minds can be changed. That's why we're fighting. And if we lose anyway, then we fight differently. We appeal. We make noise. We refuse to accept it. But we don't stop fighting because that's what family does. We don't give up on each other just because the odds are bad." Nate turned to look at him, and in the moonlight his face looked older than 12, weathered by loss and fear. "Why do you care so much? You could let me go, keep the other 4, tell yourself you saved most of us. It would be easier." "Easier doesn't mean right." Caleb held the boy's gaze. "And I didn't promise to save most of you. I promised all of you together. That promise doesn't have conditions or exceptions. It just is. Even if keeping it destroys you, even then." They sat in silence after that, 2 people holding on to hope in the darkness, waiting for Monday to come and change everything. The article hit Prospect Junction like a lightning strike. Catherine Mills hadn't just written a story, she'd written an indictment. The headline read, "Territorial Welfare Society Tears Apart Frontier Family to Satisfy Wealthy Donors," and the article beneath it was devastating in its detail. She'd included quotes from the children, testimony from Doc Harrison and Sheriff Dugan, and a scathing analysis of how the society's placement policies favored wealthy families over keeping siblings together. But it was the final paragraph that hit hardest. "In a territory that prides itself on frontier justice and individual rights, we must ask ourselves, what does it say about us that we allow children to be treated as commodities, separated from their families, and distributed to the highest bidder?" The Carver children lost their parents to disease. Must they also lose each other to bureaucratic convenience and wealthy entitlement? Within hours, copies of the Territorial Times were circulating through every ranch, saloon, and general store in 3 counties. By evening, people were talking. By the next morning, they were angry. Caleb first understood the scale of what was happening when a rancher he barely knew rode up to the cabin with a donation of smoked meat and a gruff statement. "Read about what they're trying to do to your family. Ain't right. This'll help with feeding them through winter." Then another neighbor arrived with preserves and dried beans. Then another with a winter coat that would fit Nate. Then a woman from town with fabric for making the girls new dresses, because every child deserves to look proper, and you shouldn't have to do it alone. By afternoon, there was a line of wagons and riders extending down the road, people Caleb had never met bringing supplies, offering support, asking what else they could do. The children stood on the porch watching in amazement as strangers became allies, as their story stopped being private struggle and became public cause. "Why are they helping us?" Ruth whispered, clutching a rag doll someone had brought for May. "Because people recognize injustice when they see it," Caleb said, "and because your story reminded them what matters." But not everyone was pleased. On the third day after the article ran, a fancy carriage pulled up to the ranch, much finer than Fletcher's buggy, drawn by 4 matched horses that screamed money and power. A man in his 50s climbed out, tall and stern-faced, followed by a woman in expensive traveling clothes who looked around the ranch with barely concealed disdain. Caleb recognized them from Catherine's descriptions, Jonathan and Margaret Warwick, the couple who wanted Nate badly enough to manipulate the welfare system to get him. "Mr. Harlow," Jonathan Warwick's voice was clipped, authoritative, used to being obeyed. "We need to speak with you about this situation. If by situation you mean your attempt to buy a child through bureaucratic manipulation, I'm all ears," Caleb replied, positioning himself between the Warwicks and the cabin where the children had wisely retreated inside. Warwick's face darkened. "We're offering that boy opportunities you could never provide. Education, prospects, a future beyond scratching subsistence from worthless land. How dare you stand in the way of his betterment because of your own selfish attachment?" "Selfish? I'm trying to keep siblings together. You're trying to take a boy from his family because you want free labor dressed up as charity." Margaret Warwick spoke up, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We would treat Nathan as our own son, give him advantages, raise him properly. Surely you can see that's preferable to this arrangement." She gestured dismissively at the cabin, at the ranch, at everything Caleb had built. "What I see is 2 people who think children are acquisitions, that you can just pick the one you want and discard the rest. Nate's not an orphan looking for parents. He has siblings who are his family. Taking him from them would destroy all 6 of them, but you don't care about that because it's not convenient for you. We care about giving one child a proper life rather than condemning all of them to poverty." Warwick's composure was cracking. "You can barely feed yourself, let alone 5 children. Winter's coming. You have no income, and you're one emergency away from complete destitution. How is that better than what we're offering?" "Because we're together," Nate's voice rang out from the porch. He'd come outside without Caleb noticing, and now he stood with his siblings flanking him, all 5 presenting a united front. "You can offer me all the education and prospects in the world, but you can't offer me my family, and without them, none of the rest matters." Margaret Warwick's expression softened slightly. "Dear boy, you're too young to understand what you'd be giving up. In time, you'd see that we're right." "No, ma'am. In time, I'd see that I gave up the people who matter most for people who just wanted to use me. That's not a life. That's just existing." Nate stepped forward, and Caleb felt pride surge through him at the boy's courage. "I know you think you're being generous, but the most generous thing you could do is leave us alone." Warwick's face went purple with rage. "You ungrateful little... We're offering you everything, and you're choosing poverty and struggle over comfort and security?" "I'm choosing family over everything else. That's what Caleb taught me, that some things are worth more than money or comfort or security, and family is one of them." For a long moment, the Warwicks just stared. Then Jonathan turned to Caleb with cold fury in his eyes. "This isn't over. We have influence with the territorial board, connections you can't match. That article may have swayed public opinion, but bureaucracy doesn't run on sentiment. We'll still get that boy, and when we do, you'll have no one to blame but yourself for making this difficult." They climbed back into their carriage and drove away in a cloud of dust and expensive cologne, leaving Caleb and the children standing in the yard. "Do you think they can do it?" Elsie asked quietly. "Can they still take Nate even with everyone supporting us?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted, "but we're about to find out." The territorial board hearing was scheduled for the following Friday in the county courthouse in Cheyenne, 60 miles away. Catherine Mills's article had generated enough controversy that the board couldn't ignore it. They had to at least go through the motions of a formal review. Caleb received official notification that his presence was required, as was Fletcher's, and that the board would hear testimony from all relevant parties before making a final decision on Nate's placement. The morning they left for Cheyenne, half the town turned out to see them off. Sheriff Dugan had arranged for a wagon large enough to carry all 6 of them, and Doc Harrison had volunteered to drive it himself, saying, "Someone needs to make sure you actually get there instead of getting lost or running off to Mexico." Catherine Mills rode alongside on her own horse, notebook ready, determined to document everything for a follow-up article. The journey took 2 days, and they spent the night at a way station where the owner, having read Catherine's article, refused payment and gave them the best room in the house. "For the family that's fighting back," she said simply, and Caleb felt the weight of representing more than just himself and 5 children. They'd become symbols, whether they wanted to be or not. The courthouse in Cheyenne was an imposing brick building that looked designed to intimidate. Inside, the hearing room was smaller than Caleb expected, but packed with people. Fletcher looking grimly confident, the Warwicks dressed in their finest, a cluster of territorial officials behind a raised bench, and at least 40 spectators who'd come because Catherine's articles had made this the most talked-about case in the territory. The board consisted of 3 men: Chairman Porter, a bureaucrat with kind eyes, and a reputation for fairness; Mr. Clemens, who Caleb learned owned the second-largest ranch in the territory and was known to be friendly with the Warwicks; and Reverend Michaels, a circuit preacher whose opinion carried weight in matters of morality and propriety. Chairman Porter called the hearing to order and explained the situation with admirable brevity. "We're here to determine the appropriate placement for Nathan Carver, age 12, currently in the care of Caleb Harlow under temporary guardianship. The Territorial Child Welfare Society has recommended relocation to the Warwick household. Mr. Harlow contests this recommendation. We'll hear testimony from all parties and render a decision based on the best interests of the child." Fletcher presented first, laying out his case with professional precision. He emphasized Caleb's financial instability, the unconventional nature of a single man raising 5 children, including young girls, the superior resources the Warwicks could provide. He made it sound reasonable, even compassionate, as if separating Nate was an act of mercy rather than cruelty. Then Jonathan Warwick spoke, painting a picture of the opportunities awaiting Nate at their ranch: private tutoring, inheritance prospects, social advancement. He made it sound like they were offering salvation, carefully avoiding any mention of their real motivation or the fact that they'd specifically requested a boy of working age. When it was Caleb's turn, he stood before the board with his hat in his hands and spoke the simple truth. "I'm not going to pretend I can offer Nate what the Warwicks can in terms of money or education. I can't. What I can offer is something they never mentioned: siblings. Brothers and sisters who've already lost their parents and can't afford to lose each other too. These 5 kids are a family, and breaking them apart for convenience or resources is wrong, no matter how you justify it." He told them about the auction, about finding the children on that platform, about the promise he'd made and kept through pneumonia and inspections and doubt. He told them about reading lessons by lamplight and shared meals and the way these 5 kids had learned to be a family again in just a few short weeks. "You want to know if I'm the best guardian for these children? Maybe not by your standards, but I'm the one who's keeping them together, who's fighting for them to stay whole. And sometimes that matters more than money or status or conventional propriety. Sometimes keeping a promise is more important than keeping up appearances." Doc Harrison testified about the medical care, Sheriff Dugan about the inspection, Catherine Mills about the public response to her articles. Then, unexpectedly, people from town stood up to speak: the way station owner who'd given them a room, neighbors who'd donated supplies, even Harold Mercer, who grudgingly admitted that Caleb had been buying appropriate food for 5 children and paying his bills on time. But it was Nate's testimony that changed the room. The board called him forward, this 12-year-old boy who'd been the subject of so much debate and manipulation. He stood before 3 powerful men who would decide his fate, and he spoke with a clarity that belied his age. "I know what the Warwicks are offering. I know it sounds good: education, money, a future. And maybe if I didn't have brothers and sisters, maybe if I was truly alone, that would matter more. But I'm not alone. I have Elsie, who taught me to read when Mama died. I have Ben, who makes me laugh even when everything's terrible. I have Ruth and May, who need their big brother, who've already lost too much." His voice cracked, but he pushed on. "When we lost our parents, we lost everything. Then we got separated, and we lost each other. For 6 months, I didn't know if my sisters were safe, if Ben was eating, if May even remembered us. It was worse than grief. It was like being cut into pieces and scattered. And then Caleb found us. He put us back together. He gave us a home where we could be whole again." Nate turned to look at the Warwicks, and Caleb saw no anger in his expression, just profound sadness. "You seem like nice people. You probably would give me a good life. But you'd be giving it to me, singular, not to us. And I can't be whole without them. Taking me from my family would break all six of us, and no amount of education or money would fix that. He looked back at the board. So I'm asking you, begging you, don't separate us again, please. We've survived too much to lose each other now. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret Warwick was crying quietly, and even her husband looked shaken. Several spectators were wiping their eyes. Chairman Porter's kind face had gone soft with emotion, and even Clemens, the Warwick ally, seemed troubled. Reverend Michaels leaned forward. Son, what would you say to someone who argued that staying with your siblings means giving up opportunities for a better future? Nate didn't hesitate. I'd say they don't understand what makes a future better. It's not money or status. It's the people you love being there with you. My future with my family will always be better than my future without them, no matter what else comes with it. The board conferred in low voices while the room waited in tense silence. Caleb reached over and took Nate's hand, and the boy gripped it like a lifeline. Beside them, the other four children held hands in their familiar chain, waiting for the hammer to fall one way or another. Finally, Chairman Porter spoke. This board has heard compelling testimony from all sides. The case presented by the Child Welfare Society and the Warwick family has merit in terms of resources and opportunities. However, we must weigh those considerations against other factors: family integrity, emotional bonds, and the clearly expressed wishes of the children involved. He paused, and Caleb felt his heart hammering against his ribs. It's the decision of this board that Nathan Carver should remain in the care of Caleb Harlow, along with his siblings Elsie, Benjamin, Ruth, and May. The placement will be made permanent, with the caveat that the Child Welfare Society will conduct quarterly inspections for the next year to ensure adequate care. Mr. Fletcher, your recommendation for relocation is denied. The room erupted. Spectators cheered. Catherine Mills was already scribbling furiously in her notebook, and Caleb felt Nate collapse against him with a sob of relief that seemed to come from his very soul. The other children rushed forward, and suddenly Caleb found himself at the center of a tangle of arms and tears and joy so fierce it hurt. Fletcher looked like he'd bitten into something sour, but he nodded curtly and gathered his papers. The Warwick sat in stunned silence for a moment before Margaret stood and approached Caleb with quiet dignity. Mr. Harlow, we made a mistake. We wanted a child, and we let that wanting blind us to what was right. I hope you can forgive us. She looked at Nate. I hope you all can. You're very lucky to have each other. Yes, ma'am, Nate said quietly. We know. The Warwicks left without another word, and Caleb wondered if maybe they'd learned something about the difference between wanting children and actually caring for them. Chairman Porter approached as the room began to clear. Mr. Harlow, I want you to understand what you've taken on. 5 children is a monumental responsibility. If at any point it becomes too much, it won't, Caleb interrupted. We'll figure it out together. That's what families do. Porter smiled. I believe you will. Good luck to you all. The journey back to the ranch took on a celebratory air. Doc Harrison produced a bottle of apple cider he'd been saving, and they toasted to family and promises kept and bureaucracy defeated. The children couldn't stop smiling, couldn't stop touching each other to make sure everyone was real and present and staying. When they finally reached the ranch 3 days later, it looked different to Caleb. Not just a struggling homestead anymore, but a home that had fought for the right to shelter the family living in it. They unloaded the wagon in the fading light, and Caleb noticed something on the porch. Packages, crates, bundles left by neighbors while they'd been gone. Supplies, food, even lumber with a note. For adding rooms when you're ready, welcome home. The Mercers. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb sat on the porch watching the stars and thinking about everything that had changed in 3 weeks. He'd come to Prospect Junction for a draft horse and left with 5 children. He'd fought the territorial welfare system and won. He'd turned a lonely cabin into a home full of noise and life and purpose. The door creaked open behind him, and Nate emerged, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. Can't sleep? Caleb asked. Didn't want to. Wanted to make sure this was real first. Nate settled beside him, and they sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Thank you. For everything. For the auction, for fighting Fletcher, for going to Cheyenne, for keeping your promise when it would have been easier to break it. I told you, I don't break promises, especially not the important ones. Still, not many people would have done what you did. Spent all your money, risked everything, fought that hard for kids who weren't even yours. Caleb looked at the boy beside him, this almost son who'd taught him what it meant to fight for family, to keep promises even when they cost everything. That's where you're wrong, Nate. You are mine. All 5 of you. Maybe not by blood, maybe not in the conventional way, but you're my family now, and family is always worth fighting for. Nate leaned against him, and Caleb wrapped an arm around the boy's shoulders. They sat there in the November cold, watching the stars wheel overhead, and Caleb felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness, of pieces finally fitting together, of promises kept and futures opening up. Inside, 4 other children slept peacefully, safe in the knowledge that their family wouldn't be torn apart, that they'd found someone who valued keeping them together more than money or propriety or convenience. The ranch would continue to struggle. Winter would be hard, and there would be more inspections and challenges ahead. But they'd face it together. 6 people who'd become a family, not because it was easy or conventional or what anyone expected, but because it was right. And sometimes, on the harsh frontier where survival was never guaranteed and tomorrow was always uncertain, right was the only thing that mattered. Years later, when people asked Caleb Harlow about the best decision he ever made, he'd tell them about a November day when he went to town for a horse and came home with 5 children instead. He'd tell them about a promise made on an auction platform and kept through bureaucracy and doubt and the fight of his life. He'd tell them that Nate grew up to run the ranch alongside him, that Elsie became a teacher who specialized in helping orphaned children, that Ben became a lawyer who fought for family rights, that Ruth opened a way station that never turned away families in need, and that May, little May who'd survived fever and fear, grew up to write stories about the frontier family that refused to be broken. He'd tell them that conventional wisdom said a bachelor rancher couldn't raise 5 orphaned children, that the practical choice would have been to walk away, that the smart move would have been to avoid the whole complicated mess. And then he'd smile and say that he'd never been particularly conventional or practical or smart. He'd just been stubborn enough to believe that keeping a promise mattered more than keeping things easy. In the end, that stubbornness saved 6 people, 5 children who'd lost everything and 1 lonely rancher who'd found a reason to stop being alone. It wasn't the life anyone would have predicted. It wasn't easy or simple or anything close to conventional, but it was theirs. It was whole. It was family. And that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.